The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that precision was everything. Every button polished, every crease sharp, every movement calculated. The tourists would begin arriving soon, their cameras ready to capture the stoic faces of the Queen's Guard. James had always taken pride in his role. Standing motionless for hours, enduring the heat, cold, rain, and the endless stream of visitors trying to make him smile or flinch, it was more than a job. It was a sacred duty passed down through generations of his family. His grandfather had stood at these same posts during World War II, and his father had served during the turbulent 70s. But lately, something had changed in James. Perhaps it was the birth of his own daughter 3 years ago. Or maybe it was the growing awareness that life was fragile and unpredictable. He found himself noticing things he had trained himself to ignore for decades. The wonder in children's eyes when they saw him in his full regalia. The way elderly visitors would whisper stories to their grandchildren about the brave guards who protected the Queen. On this particular Tuesday morning, James was assigned to the main entrance post, a position he had held countless times before. The protocol was clear and unbreakable. Maintain position, remain silent, show no emotion, and under no circumstances break character or engage with the public. These rules had been drilled into him during training and reinforced through years of service. As the clock struck 9, the palace gates opened to the public. The usual crowd began to form. Tourists from around the world, school groups, families on holiday. James assumed his position, rifle at his side, bearskin hat perfectly positioned, eyes fixed straight ahead. To the world, he was a statue in uniform, a symbol of British tradition and discipline. The morning progressed as usual. Visitors snapped photos, children giggled and tried to get his attention, and James remained unmoved. He had perfected the art of looking through people rather than at them, of hearing without listening, of being present while remaining detached. Around 11 o'clock, a family approached his post. From his peripheral vision, James could see a man and woman in their 30s walking slowly. Between them was a small figure that immediately caught his attention, though his training prevented him from turning his head. It was a little boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing a bright red baseball cap and holding tightly to both parents' hands. The family stopped about 10 feet away from James's position. He could hear the father speaking softly to the child, explaining who the guards were and what they did. The boy's voice was thin and weak but filled with excitement. "Is he real, Daddy?" the boy asked, his words barely audible above the general chatter of other visitors. "Yes, Tommy. He's very real and very brave," the father replied, his voice carrying an emotion that James couldn't quite identify. The mother spoke next, her words causing something to stir deep within James's chest. "The guard stands here every day to keep everyone safe, just like the doctors and nurses who take care of you." James felt his breath catch slightly. The comparison hit closer to home than the mother could have known. His own daughter had spent time in the hospital the previous year with pneumonia, and he remembered the fear, the helplessness, the gratitude toward the medical staff who had cared for her. The family lingered longer than most. James could sense the boy's fascination, his genuine amazement at seeing a real palace guard. Other children often saw him as a curiosity, a living toy to test their ability to make him react. But this child was different. There was something pure about his interest, something that spoke to the very reason James had chosen to serve. "Can I say hello to him?" the boy asked, and James heard the father gently explain that the guards couldn't talk while they were working. "But he can hear you," the mother added, "and I'm sure he likes knowing that brave boys like you come to visit." The word brave echoed in James's mind. He had always thought of himself as brave, standing guard regardless of weather or circumstance, but something told him that this little boy understood bravery in a way that went far beyond standing still in a uniform. As the minutes passed, James became increasingly aware of the family's presence. He noticed how the parents supported their son, how they spoke to him with careful tenderness, how they seemed to treasure every moment of their visit. The boy's excitement was infectious, even to someone trained to remain unmoved. Other tourists came and went, but the family remained. James began to understand that this wasn't just a casual visit to the palace. This was something special, something important. The way the parents looked at their son, the careful way they moved, the precious quality of their time together. It all suggested that moments like this were rare and treasured. The boy took a few steps closer, staying well within the acceptable distance that security allowed. James could see more clearly now, and what he saw made his heart skip. The child was thin, too thin for a boy his age. The baseball cap couldn't quite hide the fact that he had no hair underneath it. The realization hit James like a physical blow. This wasn't just any child. This was a child fighting a battle far greater than any James had ever faced in his military service. This little boy was fighting for his life, and somehow seeing a palace guard had become part of his journey. The mother pulled out a small camera, the kind families use to capture precious memories. She knelt beside her son, pointing the lens toward James's post. The boy smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire courtyard. In that moment, James understood that he was witnessing something profound, something that would change him forever. As the family finally prepared to leave, James felt an internal struggle beginning. His training, his oath, his 23 years of perfect service all demanded that he remain exactly as he was. But something deeper, something fundamentally human was stirring within him. The boy waved goodbye, a small gesture that no one else even noticed. James watched them walk away, the parents supporting their brave little son between them, and felt something crack inside the armor of protocol that had protected him for so many years. He had no idea that this encounter was just the beginning, or that the choices he would make in the coming days would challenge everything he had ever believed about duty, rules, and what it truly meant to serve. That evening, James sat in his small London flat, still wearing his civilian clothes but unable to shake the image of the little boy in the red baseball cap. His wife Sarah noticed his unusual quietness during dinner. After 20 years of marriage, she could read his moods like a familiar book. "Rough day at the palace?" she asked, settling beside him on the couch where he sat staring at nothing in particular. James hesitated. In all his years of service, he had rarely brought work home. The Queen's Guard learned early to compartmentalize, to leave the day's experiences at the palace gates. But tonight was different. There was a family today, he began slowly. A little boy, maybe Emma's age when she was younger. James paused, searching for the right words. He was sick, Sarah, really sick. Sarah's expression softened. Their own daughter, Emma, now 12 and perfectly healthy, had given them enough hospital scares to understand the fear that lived in every parent's heart. He looked at me like I was some kind of hero, James continued. But I just stood there. I couldn't even acknowledge him. "That's your job," Sarah reminded him gently. "You know that." "I know," James replied. But his voice carried doubt for the first time in years. The next morning brought a typical London drizzle, the kind that made tourists huddle under umbrellas and question their vacation choices. James took his post at 7 sharp, an hour before public access began. The early morning routine helped him center himself, prepare for another day of statue-like duty. But as 9 o'clock approached, James found himself scanning the crowd with unusual attention. He told himself he was simply being vigilant, maintaining security awareness. Deep down, though, he was looking for a red baseball cap and a brave little smile. The morning passed without any sign of the family. James felt an unexpected disappointment, followed immediately by confusion at his own reaction. In 23 years, he had never looked forward to seeing specific visitors. The whole point was to treat everyone with the same impartial professionalism. Around noon, during the changing of the guard ceremony, his fellow Sergeant William Thompson approached for their brief handover conversation. "You seem different today," William observed, adjusting his own ceremonial sword. "Everything all right?" James considered sharing yesterday's experience but decided against it. How could he explain that a sick child had somehow gotten under his skin, that he was questioning protocols he had followed without hesitation for over 2 decades? "Just tired," James replied, the standard response that covered a multitude of unspoken troubles. The afternoon shift brought larger crowds. School groups, tour buses, and families filled the courtyard with the usual mixture of excitement and reverence. James maintained his position perfectly, but part of his mind remained elsewhere, replaying the previous day's encounter. At approximately 3:30, James spotted them. The same couple, the same careful, loving attention to their son's every step. Today the boy wore a different cap, blue this time, but the careful way his parents flanked him was unmistakable. They approached more directly this time, stopping closer to James's position. The boy looked up at him with the same wonder as before, but James noticed something different. The child seemed smaller, more fragile than he had just 24 hours earlier. "Look, Tommy," the mother said softly. "It's the same guard from yesterday. He's been standing here protecting everyone while you were sleeping." The boy nodded solemnly as if this responsibility weighed on his young mind. "Does he ever get tired?" Tommy asked. "I'm sure he does," the father replied. "But he's very strong and very dedicated." James felt those words settle into his chest like stones. Strong and dedicated. Is that what he was? Or was he simply following rules without considering their purpose? Tommy took a small step forward, still well within the acceptable distance. "My daddy says you're a real soldier," he said, his young voice carrying across the space between them. For the first time in his career, James wanted desperately to respond. The urge to kneel down to speak to this brave child, to somehow acknowledge his courage, was almost overwhelming. His training held him in place, but barely. The family stayed longer this time, nearly 30 minutes. James became aware of other visitors watching them, some with curiosity, others with growing understanding. A few older visitors seemed to recognize the signs, the careful movements, the precious way the parents treated their time together, the child's obvious illness. An elderly gentleman approached the family and spoke quietly to the parents. James couldn't hear the words, but he saw the man's gentle nod toward Tommy, the understanding that passed between adults who recognized a child fighting an impossible battle. As the afternoon wore on, more people seemed drawn to the scene. Not intrusively, but with the kind of quiet respect that emerges when strangers recognize something sacred happening in their midst. James realized that Tommy wasn't just affecting him. The boy's presence was touching everyone who took the time to really see. Around 4 o'clock, something unexpected happened. Tommy pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and showed it to his parents. After a brief, whispered conversation, his mother helped him walk to the very edge of the acceptable visitor area. "I drew you a picture," Tommy called out softly, holding up the paper. "My mom says you can't take it while you're working, but I wanted you to see it." James's peripheral vision caught glimpses of the drawing, stick figures in red uniforms, a child's interpretation of guards and perhaps a palace. The gesture was so innocent, so heartfelt, that James felt something fundamental shift inside him. The internal battle that had been brewing since yesterday intensified. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to remain motionless, to maintain the dignity and discipline of his position. But a deeper voice, one that spoke of compassion and human connection, grew stronger with each passing moment. Other tourists had stopped to watch now, sensing something special occurring. James became aware of cameras, but not the usual tourist snapshots. These were people documenting what they instinctively knew was a meaningful moment. Tommy's parents explained gently that they needed to leave soon, that he had a doctor's appointment that afternoon. The word appointment carried weight that only families dealing with serious illness would understand. As they prepared to go, Tommy looked up at James one more time. "Will you be here tomorrow?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything James had ever believed about his role. Would he be here tomorrow? Of course he would. But would he be the same man, bound by the same unquestioning adherence to protocol? The mother placed her hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "The guard has very important work to do," she said. "But I think he knows how much it means to you that you came to visit." As the family walked away, James felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another day of standing guard. But something had changed irreversibly. The question was no longer whether he would see Tommy again, but what he would do when that moment came. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. Sarah worked quietly nearby, but he could feel her occasional glances, her growing concern about his unusual behavior. Finally, she sat across from him. "James, what's really going on? You've been different since yesterday." This time James told her everything. The sick little boy, the drawings, the way Tommy looked at him like he was something special. The growing feeling that his rigid adherence to protocol might be missing something important about what it truly meant to serve. Sarah listened without judgment, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you thinking about doing?" she asked finally, her voice careful but not discouraging. "I don't know," James admitted, "but I can't keep pretending that little boy doesn't exist. He's fighting a battle I can't even imagine, and somehow I've become part of his world. That has to mean something." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Whatever you decide," she said, "remember that the best soldiers aren't the ones who follow orders blindly. They're the ones who understand what they're really fighting for." As James lay in bed that night, he knew that tomorrow would bring more than just another shift. It would bring a choice that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what it meant to be truly brave. Wednesday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of perfect London day that made tourists believe they had chosen the right time to visit. James arrived at his post earlier than usual, using the extra time to steady his nerves and consider what he might do if Tommy returned. The morning crowd was larger than usual, drawn by the pleasant weather. James took his position with mechanical precision, but his mind was anything but focused. Every fiber of his being felt alert, charged with possibility and apprehension in equal measure. At precisely 10:15, he saw them. The family approached with the same careful pace, but today something was different. Tommy's steps seemed slower, and he leaned more heavily on his parents' support. The blue cap from yesterday had been replaced with a bright yellow one, but James could see that the boy's face was paler, his movements more deliberate. They positioned themselves in their usual spot, close enough for conversation but respectful of the boundaries. Tommy looked up at James with those same bright eyes, but there was something new there, a kind of determined urgency that made James's chest tighten. "Mummy says this might be our last visit for a while," Tommy announced to his parents, though his voice was clearly intended for James's ears as well. "I start a new treatment next week, and the doctors say I'll need to stay in the hospital." The words hit James like a physical blow. This might be the last time he would see this brave little boy. The realization crystallized everything he had been feeling over the past 2 days into a moment of absolute clarity. James made his first conscious decision to break protocol. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone not paying close attention. He shifted his gaze just slightly, allowing his eyes to meet Tommy's directly for the briefest of moments. The connection lasted less than a second, but the boy's face lit up with joy. "Mom, Dad." He looked at me. The guard looked right at me. The parents exchanged glances, uncertain whether to encourage their son's excitement or gently correct him. But they saw the spark in Tommy's eyes, the first genuine enthusiasm he had shown in weeks, and chose to let the moment stand. "I think he likes you, sweetheart," the mother said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Emboldened by his first small rebellion, James began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. The way other visitors looked at Tommy's family with sympathy and respect. The gentle nods from older tourists who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, the space that naturally formed around the family, as if other people instinctively recognized the sacred nature of these moments. A tour group approached, led by an enthusiastic guide explaining the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard. As they settled near James's position, the guide began the usual explanation about the Guard's training, their dedication, and their unwavering commitment to duty. "The Guards undergo rigorous training," the guide explained to the gathered tourists. "They learn to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions or distractions. Nothing can make them break their concentration or abandon their post." James felt the irony of those words as he stood there, his concentration entirely focused on a sick little boy, rather than his official duties. The traditional definition of dedication was being challenged by a deeper understanding of what service really meant. Tommy had been listening to the tour guide with interest, and when the formal explanation ended, he raised his small hand like a student in school. "Excuse me," he said in his thin but clear voice. "Can I ask the guard a question?" The tour guide smiled condescendingly. "I'm afraid the guards can't speak while they're on duty, young man. They have to remain completely focused on protecting the palace." "But I just wanted to say thank you," Tommy persisted. "He makes me feel safe." The simple statement rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in still water. James felt its impact in his chest, a weight of responsibility and privilege that went far beyond anything in his training manual. An elderly woman in the tour group stepped forward slightly. "That's very sweet, dear," she said to Tommy. I'm sure the guard is honored by your thanks, even if he can't say so. James made his second conscious decision to break protocol. Moving only his hands, which were positioned at his sides, he made the slightest adjustment to his grip on his rifle. To anyone not watching carefully, it would look like a normal, unconscious movement. But to Tommy, who was studying his every detail, it was clearly intentional. The boy's eyes widened. He heard me. He heard what I said. The mother knelt beside her son, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I think he did, Tommy. I think he knows how brave you are. The tour group began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The guide, initially annoyed by the disruption to his routine presentation, found himself watching with growing interest. This wasn't just a random encounter between a child and a guard. This was something much more profound. As the tour group moved on, other visitors began to take notice of Tommy's family. Word spread quietly through the courtyard. There was a sick little boy here, and somehow the normally unmovable guard was responding to him. James became aware of more cameras pointing in his direction, but these weren't the usual tourist shots. People were documenting what they sensed was a special moment, a story worth remembering and sharing. Around noon, a palace supervisor made his routine inspection rounds. James recognized Sergeant Major Collins, a career military man known for his strict interpretation of regulations. Collins approached James's post with his usual authoritative stride, clipboard in hand. The supervisor's presence created immediate tension. Tommy's family, sensing the official nature of this man's visit, stepped back slightly. James felt his heart rate increase, knowing that any deviation from perfect protocol would be noticed and reported. Sergeant Major Collins positioned himself directly in front of James, close enough for private conversation. "Everything in order here, Sergeant Mitchell?" he asked in his crisp military tone. "Yes, sir," James replied, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "I've been hearing interesting reports about this post," Collins continued, his eyes scanning James's uniform for any imperfection. "Visitors talking about unusual interactions. Anything you'd like to report?" James felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could deny everything, return to perfect protocol compliance, and likely never see Tommy again. Or he could stand by his growing conviction that sometimes serving others meant more than simply following rules. "There's a sick child, sir," James said quietly. "Terminal cancer. He visits with his family." Collins followed James's slight eye movement toward Tommy, who was watching the conversation with obvious concern. The supervisor's expression didn't change, but James noticed a subtle shift in his posture. "I see," Collins said simply. "And your assessment of the situation?" James chose his words carefully. "The child finds comfort in the presence of the guard, sir. It seems to give him strength for his battle." For a long moment, Sergeant Major Collins said nothing. He studied Tommy's family, took in the boy's obvious illness, the parents' careful attention, the respectful distance maintained by other visitors who had begun to understand the situation. "Carry on," Sergeant Collins said finally. "Maintain appropriate standards." As the supervisor walked away, James felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The phrase appropriate standards could mean anything. Was it a warning to return to rigid protocol, or permission to continue showing compassion within reasonable bounds? Tommy's father approached the edge of the visitor area. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly, clearly concerned that his son's presence might have caused trouble for the guard. James made his third deliberate break with protocol. He gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible but unmistakably intentional. The father's face relaxed with understanding and gratitude. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the courtyard. A woman in her 50s, well-dressed and carrying herself with obvious authority, approached Tommy's family directly. James recognized her as Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the palace's senior administrators. "Excuse me," Mrs. Hartwell said to Tommy's parents. "I'm Elizabeth Hartwell from the palace staff. I couldn't help but notice your son's interest in our guards." Tommy's mother immediately looked worried, as if they might be in trouble for disrupting the normal order of things. "I'm sorry if we've been a bother. Tommy just loves coming here." "Oh, no bother at all," Mrs. Hartwell assured her quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to chat. Perhaps there's something we could arrange for Tommy." James watched this conversation with growing amazement. Word had clearly spread through the palace staff about the little boy, who had captured everyone's attention. The fact that a senior administrator was taking personal interest suggested that Tommy's story was touching hearts throughout the organization. As the day ended and James prepared to hand over his post to the evening guard, he realized that everything had changed. He was no longer just following orders or maintaining traditions. He had become part of something larger, something that mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. The choice he had been wrestling with for days was no longer a choice at all. Tommy had shown him what real bravery looked like, and now it was James's turn to be brave in return. Thursday morning brought an air of anticipation that James could feel even before he reached the palace. Mrs. Hartwell had spoken with Tommy's family the previous afternoon, and though James didn't know the details of their conversation, he sensed that something significant was about to happen. As he prepared for his shift, James noticed unusual activity among the palace staff. Custodians were paying extra attention to his section of the courtyard, and several administrators he rarely saw were making seemingly casual inspections of the area. At 9 o'clock sharp, Tommy arrived with his parents, but this time they weren't alone. Mrs. Hartwell accompanied them, along with a palace photographer and someone James didn't recognize, a woman in casual clothes carrying a small recording device. "Good morning, Tommy," Mrs. Hartwell said warmly as they approached James's post. "Are you ready for your special visit?" James felt his pulse quicken. A special visit meant official palace involvement, which could go either way. Either his small acts of compassion had been approved and would be formalized, or he was about to face serious consequences for breaking protocol. Mrs. Hartwell addressed the small gathering that had begun to form. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through social media, perhaps through the mysterious way that heartwarming stories travel, and more people than usual were present, all watching with obvious interest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Hartwell announced in her clear, authoritative voice, "today we have a very special young visitor. Tommy here has been coming to see our guards, and we've learned that he's fighting a very brave battle against cancer." A murmur of sympathy and understanding rippled through the crowd. James noticed several people discreetly wiping their eyes. "With permission from His Majesty's office," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "we've arranged something special for Tommy today." James felt his world tilt. Permission from His Majesty's office meant this had gone all the way to the top. Someone, somewhere in the highest levels of the monarchy, had decided that a sick little boy mattered more than strict adherence to centuries-old protocol. Mrs. Hartwell turned toward James. "Sergeant Mitchell, you have permission to speak with our young friend." The words released something in James that had been building for days. For the first time in 23 years of service, he had official permission to be human while in uniform. James relaxed his rigid posture slightly and looked directly at Tommy. The boy's face was radiant with joy and disbelief. "Hello, Tommy," James said, his voice carrying across the courtyard clearly. "I've been looking forward to meeting you properly." Tommy's legs seemed to give out from pure excitement. His father caught him and helped him steady himself. "You can really talk," Tommy exclaimed. "I can indeed," James replied, allowing a warm smile to cross his face. "And I've heard that you're one of the bravest soldiers I've ever met." The comparison to a soldier made Tommy stand a little straighter, despite his obvious physical weakness. "I'm fighting cancer," he said with matter-of-fact courage that made every adult present catch their breath. "I know you are," James said, "and from what I can see, you're winning." Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with a small wrapped package. "Tommy, we have something for you. It's from all of us here at the palace, but especially from Sergeant Mitchell." Tommy's hands shook slightly as he unwrapped the gift. Inside was a miniature version of the Queen's Guard uniform, a perfect replica scaled for a child, complete with the famous bearskin hat. "Now you can be a guard too," James said. Honorary Guard Tommy, protector of brave hearts everywhere. The crowd that had gathered was now openly emotional. The palace photographer was capturing every moment, but even he had to pause occasionally to compose himself. Tommy's mother helped him into the small uniform jacket. Despite his illness, despite his pale complexion and obvious frailty, when he put on that red tunic, he transformed. He stood as straight as his condition allowed, mimicked James's posture, and for a moment looked every inch the soldier he proclaimed himself to be. "Can I stand guard with you?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with hope. James looked to Mrs. Hartwell, who nodded her approval. "Of course you can, Guard Tommy. But only for a few minutes. Even the bravest soldiers need their rest. What happened next would be talked about in palace circles for years to come. Tommy positioned himself next to James, copying his stance as best he could. For 5 precious minutes, 2 guards stood together, one in regulation uniform with decades of training, the other in a miniature costume with more courage than anyone had a right to expect from such a small person. The woman with the recording device, who James now realized must be a journalist, was documenting everything. This wasn't just a private moment of kindness. It was becoming a story that would reach far beyond the palace walls. "Tommy," the journalist said gently, "can you tell me why you wanted to meet the guard?" Tommy thought carefully before answering, his young face serious with concentration. "When I'm in the hospital, sometimes I get scared," he said. "But I think about the guards, how they're brave every day, and it helps me be brave too." James felt something break open in his chest. This child had been drawing strength from him, from the very protocols and traditions that James had sometimes seen as empty ceremony. In Tommy's eyes, the Queen's Guard represented something pure and powerful. The idea that courage could be sustained, that duty could triumph over fear. "And now that you've met him?" the journalist prompted. "Now I know that being brave isn't about not being scared," Tommy said with startling wisdom. "It's about doing your job even when you are scared." The crowd was completely silent now, absorbing the profound truth that had just come from a 7-year-old boy fighting for his life. James knelt down, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. The action would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, but nothing about this day was normal. "Guard Tommy," he said formally, "I hereby declare you the bravest member of the Queen's Guard I have ever had the honor to serve with." Tommy's smile could have powered the entire palace. He saluted James with all the precision his small frame could muster, and James returned the salute with equal formality. Mrs. Hartwell announced that Tommy would receive an official certificate designating him as an honorary guard, signed by palace officials and suitable for framing, but James could see that the boy was tiring. The excitement and physical demands of the morning were taking their toll. "I think Guard Tommy needs to report for some rest and medical attention," James said gently. Tommy nodded, understanding that their special time was ending. But as his parents prepared to help him out of the miniature uniform, he stopped and looked up at James one more time. "Will you remember me when I'm in the hospital?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. James felt his own eyes fill with tears for the first time in uniform. "Guard Tommy," he said, "I will think about you every single day. And when you're feeling scared or tired, you remember that Sergeant Mitchell is standing guard, keeping watch, and thinking about the bravest soldier he's ever known." As the family prepared to leave, accompanied by Mrs. Hartwell and the journalist, James realized that this day had changed everything, not just for him but for everyone who had witnessed it. The story would spread, and with it, a reminder that sometimes the most important rules are the ones written in human hearts rather than regulation manuals. Tommy took a few steps away, then turned back one final time. "Sergeant Mitchell," he called. "Yes, Guard Tommy?" "Thank you for being my friend." As they disappeared into the crowd, James resumed his official position, but he was no longer the same man who had taken his post that morning. He had learned something fundamental about the difference between serving an institution and serving humanity. The journalist lingered for a moment, finishing her notes. Before leaving, she approached James one final time. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "do you have any concerns about breaking protocol today?" James considered the question seriously. "Ma'am," he replied, "I've spent 23 years learning how to be a perfect soldier. Today, Tommy taught me how to be a good man. I think the Queen would approve." As the afternoon wore on, James noticed that other visitors looked at him differently. Word of the morning's events had spread, and people approached his post with a new kind of respect. He wasn't just a tourist attraction anymore. He was a symbol of something deeper, something that connected duty and compassion in ways that transcended regulations. That evening, as James walked home through the London streets, he carried with him the image of Tommy's face when he first heard James speak his name. It was a moment that had changed both of them forever, and James knew that whatever happened next, he had finally understood what it truly meant to serve. By Friday morning, everything had changed. James arrived at the palace to find himself at the center of a media storm he never could have anticipated. The journalist's story had been published overnight, complete with the photographs of Tommy in his miniature guard uniform, and the response had been overwhelming. Royal Guard breaks protocol for dying child, read the headline in one newspaper. The bravest guard. How one soldier chose compassion over rules, proclaimed another. But it was the online response that truly showed the story's impact. Social media was flooded with shares, comments, and reactions from people around the world who had been moved by Tommy's courage and James's humanity. Mrs. Hartwell met James at the staff entrance, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of excitement and stress. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, "I hope you're prepared for what today might bring. The story has gone viral, as they say. We've had interview requests from 17 countries and over 300 media outlets." James felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. He had wanted to help Tommy, not become an international news story. "How is this affecting the palace?" he asked, concerned that his actions might have created problems for his colleagues and superiors. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Mrs. Hartwell replied, leading him toward the administrative offices. "There's someone who wants to speak with you." James found himself in a room he had never entered before, face to face with Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the entire Queen's Guard. For a moment, James's training kicked in and he snapped to perfect attention, expecting the worst, at ease. "Sergeant," Colonel Harrison said, but his tone was unreadable. "I've been reading some interesting reports about your recent activities." "Sir, I can explain," James began, but the colonel raised a hand to stop him. "Tell me about the boy," Colonel Harrison said simply. For the next 10 minutes, James found himself recounting the entire story from Tommy's first visit through yesterday's emotional ceremony. The colonel listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When James finished, Colonel Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Sergeant Mitchell, in your opinion, what is the primary duty of the Queen's Guard?" The question felt like a test, but James had learned too much over the past week to give the textbook answer. "Sir, I used to think it was to follow protocol perfectly and maintain the dignity of the crown. But now, I think it's to represent the best of what service means, to show that strength and compassion can exist together." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "Yesterday morning I received a phone call. It was from Buckingham Palace. They had seen the early reports of your interaction with young Tommy, and they wanted to know if this represented a breakdown in discipline or something else entirely." James felt his heart sink. A call from Buckingham Palace could only mean trouble at the highest levels. "I told them," the colonel continued, "that it represented exactly what the Guard should be. Soldiers who understand that true strength comes from protecting what matters most." They agreed. Relief flooded through James, followed immediately by amazement. "Sir, the palace has received over 5,000 messages of support since the story broke," Colonel Harrison explained. "Letters, emails, social media posts from people all over the world saying that your actions represent the very best of British values. Parents with sick children, cancer survivors, military families, all saying that you've shown them what real heroism looks like." James struggled to process this information. He had simply tried to comfort a sick child, and somehow it had become something much larger. "There's more," the colonel said. "We've been contacted by several children's hospitals. Apparently, Tommy's story has inspired other sick children. They're asking if guards might be able to visit, to share some of the strength that Tommy found in meeting you." The idea was both thrilling and overwhelming. James had never imagined that his small act of rebellion could grow into something that might help other children facing their own battles. "Sir, what does this mean for my service record? For protocol going forward?" Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time in their conversation. "It means, Sergeant, that sometimes the most important traditions are the ones we create, not the ones we inherit. Your actions with Tommy will become part of our training, an example of how to balance duty with humanity." As James returned to his post that morning, he noticed that the crowd in the courtyard was different. Larger, yes, but also more purposeful. People weren't just here as tourists. They were here because of Tommy's story. They looked at James with new understanding, seeing not just a ceremonial figure, but someone who had chosen compassion over convention. Around 11 o'clock, Mrs. Hartwell approached his post with a small group of visitors. James recognized them immediately. They were families with sick children, faces marked by the same careful hope and precious tenderness he had seen in Tommy's parents. "Sergeant Mitchell," Mrs. Hartwell said, I'd like you to meet some people who were inspired by Tommy's story. What followed was unlike anything James had experienced in his military career. One by one, parents approached with their children. Some bawled from chemotherapy, others using wheelchairs or walking with the careful steps of those fighting serious illness. Each family thanked him, not just for what he had done for Tommy, but for showing them that strength and kindness could coexist. A 10-year-old girl named Lucy, fighting leukemia, asked if she could shake his hand. An 8-year-old boy named Marcus, recovering from brain surgery, wanted to know if he could be brave like Tommy. Each interaction required James to balance his official duties with these profound human moments, but he found that the balance came naturally now. During his lunch break, James received an unexpected phone call. It was Tommy's father. "Sergeant Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me calling. Mrs. Hartwell gave me your number. I wanted to update you on Tommy's condition." James felt his stomach tighten. The call could bring good news or devastating news, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for either. "Tommy started his new treatment yesterday," the father continued. "It's aggressive and he's very weak. But something amazing happened this morning. The nurses told us he's been telling every patient on the ward about his day as an honorary guard. He's inspired 3 other kids to get out of bed for their physical therapy." James felt his eyes well up. Even in his sickest moments, Tommy was still being a guard, still protecting and inspiring others. "He asked me to tell you something," Tommy's father continued. "He says he's still standing guard, just from a different post now. The hospital is his palace, and he's protecting the other kids who are scared." The wisdom and courage of this 7-year-old continued to amaze James. Tommy had understood something profound about service, that it wasn't about the uniform or the ceremony, but about using your strength to help others find theirs. "Is there anything I can do?" James asked. "Any way I can help?" "Actually, there is," Tommy's father replied. "The hospital staff asked if you might be willing to visit. Not officially, not in uniform, but just as James. Tommy talks about you constantly, and seeing you might give him the strength to get through this next phase of treatment." James didn't hesitate. "Of course. When would be good?" "Are you sure? I know this is beyond anything you signed up for." James thought about that for a moment. A week ago he would have agreed. Standing guard was what he had signed up for. But Tommy had taught him that standing guard meant so much more than following a routine. "Sir," James said, "Tommy taught me what I really signed up for. I'll be there." That afternoon, as James completed his shift, he realized that the story was far from over. Tommy's courage had started something that would continue to grow, touching lives in ways none of them could have predicted. The boy who had come to see a guard had ended up showing everyone what true bravery looked like. And James, who had spent decades learning to be strong, had discovered that the strongest thing he could do was care. As he walked home that evening, James carried with him a new understanding of service. He was still a Queen's Guard, still bound by duty and tradition, but now he knew that the highest honor wasn't in perfect protocol. It was in perfect compassion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors inspired by Tommy's story, and new opportunities to show that strength and kindness were not opposites, but partners in the deepest kind of service. The guard had become the guarded, protected by the love of a brave little boy who had changed everything by simply being himself. Sunday afternoon found James standing outside Great Ormond Street Hospital, clutching a small package and feeling more nervous than he had ever felt before taking his post at the palace. This was different from his official duties. Here he wasn't Sergeant Mitchell of the Queen's Guard. He was simply James, a man who had promised to visit a sick little boy. The hospital bustled with activity, but there was an underlying quietness that spoke of serious battles being fought behind every door. As James approached the children's cancer ward, he was struck by the contrast between this place and the palace. Both were institutions dedicated to protection, but here the enemy was invisible, and the courage required was of an entirely different order. Dr. Sarah Chen, Tommy's oncologist, met James at the ward entrance. She was a small woman with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering, but she smiled warmly as she shook his hand. "Tommy has been talking about you non-stop," she said, leading him down a corridor decorated with children's artwork. "Your visit at the palace seems to have given him something to focus on besides his treatment. We can't underestimate how important that is for a child in his situation. How is he doing?" James asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Dr. Chen paused outside Tommy's room. The treatment is harsh. It has to be, given how aggressive his cancer is. He's weak and there are days when he can barely keep his eyes open. But his spirit has been remarkable. He's become something of a leader among the other children here. Before entering the room, Dr. Chen showed James around the ward's common area. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. The walls were covered with drawings, but not the usual colorful chaos of children's art. These were pictures of guards, of palaces, of small figures in red uniforms standing tall and brave. Tommy started this, Dr. Chen explained. After his visit to see you, he began drawing guards and telling the other children about being brave. Now they all do it. They call it their guard gallery. A nurse approached them, introducing herself as Linda, Tommy's primary care nurse. You should know, she said to James, that Tommy has been preparing for your visit like it's the most important event in his life. He's been practicing standing at attention even though it exhausts him. He wants to show you that he's still being a good guard. James felt his throat tighten. The image of a sick child practicing military posture in a hospital bed was both heartbreaking and inspiring. There's something else, Linda continued. Tommy's roommate Alex is 8 years old and has been having a really difficult time with his treatment. He's been refusing to cooperate with physical therapy, won't eat, barely speaks. But since Tommy started talking about the guards, Alex has been listening. Tommy's convinced him that guards have to stay strong, and Alex has started participating in his treatment again. As they approached Tommy's room, James could hear voices inside, children's voices talking excitedly. Linda knocked softly and pushed the door open. Tommy, your special visitor is here. The room fell silent, and then James heard a small, familiar voice say, Guard Tommy reporting for duty. James entered the room to find Tommy sitting up in his hospital bed, wearing the miniature guard jacket over his hospital gown. Despite the IV lines attached to his small arm and the obvious effects of his treatment, his posture was as straight as he could manage, and his eyes blazed with determination. But Tommy wasn't alone. 3 other children were in the room, 2 in wheelchairs and 1 standing with the help of a walker. All were wearing makeshift versions of guard uniforms created from red clothing and improvised accessories. Sergeant Mitchell, Tommy exclaimed, his voice weaker than James remembered but filled with joy. I want you to meet my regiment. This is Guard Alex, Guard Maria, and Guard Sam. We've all been standing guard together. James felt overwhelmed by the scene before him. These children, fighting battles that would challenge the strongest adults, had turned Tommy's experience into something that gave them all strength. Guards, James said formally, snapping to attention himself. It's an honor to inspect your unit. The children beamed with pride. Alex, the boy who had been refusing treatment, managed a shaky salute. Maria, whose chart showed she was fighting brain cancer, giggled with delight. Sam, barely 6 years old and using a walker due to bone cancer, stood as tall as his condition would allow. James spent the next hour with the children, hearing their stories, admiring their artwork, and marveling at their courage. Each child had found something different in the guard concept. Alex saw it as a way to be strong when he felt weak. Maria found it helped her when she was scared. And Sam liked the idea that guards protected people, which made him feel important instead of helpless. Tommy had brought the small package James had carried, a collection of authentic guard badges and pins, officially sanctioned by the palace for the children's collection. As he presented them, James realized that what had started as a simple gesture of kindness had become something much larger. Tommy, James said quietly as the other children examined their gifts, I need to tell you something important. You've taught me more about being a real guard than 23 years of training ever did. Tommy looked confused. But you're the real guard. You stand at the palace and protect everyone. You're right, James replied. But you've shown me that the most important protection we can offer is helping others find their own courage. Every day you and your friends here are guarding each other's hearts, helping each other stay brave. That's the most important kind of guard duty there is. Dr. Chen had been watching from the doorway and she stepped forward now. James, would you mind if I showed you something? She led him to her office where she pulled out a thick folder. These are letters, she explained, from children's hospitals around the world. Tommy's story has reached other sick children, and they've started their own guard units. Pediatric wards in Australia, Canada, Germany. Everywhere children are fighting serious illnesses. Tommy's example is helping them find strength. James stared at the folder, struggling to comprehend the reach of one little boy's courage. How is this possible? Social media, news stories, word of mouth, Dr. Chen explained. But more than that, it's the universal nature of what you and Tommy created together. Every child understands the need to be brave, and every child can relate to wanting to be a hero. You gave Tommy a way to see himself as powerful instead of powerless, and he's sharing that gift with others. When James returned to Tommy's room, he found the children engaged in what they called guard training, gentle exercises that doubled as physical therapy, but reframed as preparation for their important protective duties. We practice every day, Tommy explained proudly. Even when I feel really sick, I remember that guards don't give up. Alex has gotten so much stronger since he joined our unit. Alex nodded eagerly. Tommy says guards look out for each other. So when I don't want to do my medicine, the other guards help me remember that we have to stay strong for our mission. As the afternoon drew to a close, James knew he had to leave, but saying goodbye felt impossible. These children had taken his simple act of compassion and multiplied it into something that was healing hearts around the world. Will you come back? Tommy asked, his voice small and tired now as the excitement of the visit began to fade. Of course I will, James promised. Guards always look out for each other. Tommy smiled and closed his eyes, exhausted but content. Sergeant Mitchell? He whispered. Yes, Guard Tommy. Thank you for showing me that being sick doesn't mean you can't be brave. As James left the hospital that evening, he carried with him a new understanding of the ripple effects of kindness. What he had thought was a simple gesture, acknowledging a sick child's presence, had become a movement that was touching lives across the globe. The next morning, when James took his post at the palace, he did so with renewed purpose. He was no longer just standing guard over a building or following ancient protocol. He was part of something larger, a network of courage that connected a London palace to hospital wards around the world, all anchored by the unshakable bravery of a 7-year-old boy named Tommy. The guard had learned the deepest truth about service, that strength shared becomes strength multiplied, and that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change everything. 6 months later, James stood at his familiar post in the palace courtyard, but everything had changed. The Tommy Protocol, as it had come to be known within the Guard, had become an official part of their training. Guards were now taught to recognize moments when human compassion should take precedence over rigid protocol, and the story of Tommy's courage was shared with every new recruit. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect for the special ceremony that was about to take place. James had been chosen to participate in something unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard, the first official induction of an honorary guard who had truly earned the title through service to others. At exactly 10 o'clock, a small procession approached the palace gates. Mrs. Hartwell led the way, followed by Dr. Chen, several hospital staff members, and a group that made James's heart soar. Tommy walking steadily on his own, his face bright with health and excitement. The treatment had worked. After months of aggressive chemotherapy, countless hospital stays, and more courage than anyone should have to show, Tommy was in remission. He had beaten cancer, but more importantly, he had beaten it while inspiring hundreds of other children to find their own strength. Behind Tommy walked his hospital regiment, Alex, Maria, Sam, and a dozen other children in various stages of treatment and recovery. They wore their makeshift guard uniforms with pride, but today they also wore something new. Official certificates declaring them honorary members of the Queen's Guard Support Corps. The palace courtyard had been transformed for the occasion. A small platform had been erected, decorated with flowers sent by children's hospitals from around the world. Representatives from media outlets were present, but they maintained a respectful distance, understanding that this was primarily a celebration for the children who had turned their fight against illness into a mission of mutual support. Colonel Harrison stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, which included not only tourists but also families who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. Ladies and gentlemen, the colonel began, today we gather to recognize something extraordinary. 6 months ago, a young boy named Tommy came to this palace and taught all of us a lesson about true bravery. What began as one child's fascination with the Queen's Guard has become a global movement of courage. James watched Tommy's face as the colonel spoke. The boy stood straighter than James had ever seen him, not from military training, but from genuine pride in what he and his fellow young guards had accomplished. The Honorary Guard Corps, Colonel Harrison continued, now includes over 2,000 children from 43 countries. These young people have redefined what it means to stand guard, proving that the most important battles are often fought not on battlefields, but in hospital rooms, treatment centers, and the quiet moments when we choose hope over fear. Mrs. Hartwell approached the platform carrying an ornate wooden box. Inside, visible to the crowd, was an authentic Queen's Guard medal, not a replica or honorary version, but a real medal specially commissioned for this occasion. "Tommy," Colonel Harrison called. "Please step forward." Tommy walked to the platform with steady steps, his parents beaming with pride behind him. James felt his own eyes mist as he remembered the frail little boy who had first approached his post 6 months ago. "Honorary Guard Tommy," the colonel said formally, "you are hereby awarded the Medal of Exceptional Service for your outstanding contribution to the mission of the Queen's Guard. Through your courage, leadership, and unwavering commitment to protecting the spirits of others, you have exemplified the highest ideals of military service." As the medal was placed around Tommy's neck, the entire courtyard erupted in applause, but it was the expression on Tommy's face that James would remember forever. Pure joy mixed with a deep understanding of the responsibility he had carried and shared with so many others. Tommy stepped to the microphone that had been set up for him. His voice, stronger now but still carrying the wisdom that had developed through his ordeal, carried clearly across the courtyard. "Thank you to everyone who helped me become a real guard," he said. "But I want to say something important. Being a guard isn't about standing still or looking brave. It's about helping other people find their own brave. Every kid who's sick, every kid who's scared, they can all be guards too." He paused, looking directly at James. "Sergeant Mitchell taught me that the best guards are the ones who care about people. So all of us honorary guards promise to keep standing watch, to keep helping other kids who need to find their brave." The crowd's response was overwhelming. But James noticed something else. Throughout the ceremony, other visitors to the palace had been watching with obvious emotion. Parents held their children a little closer. Elderly visitors wiped away tears. And everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that transcended typical royal ceremony. After the formal ceremony ended, Tommy approached James privately. The medal gleamed on his chest, but his expression was serious. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "I have something to tell you." James knelt down to Tommy's eye level, as he had learned to do during their many visits over the past months. "The doctors say I'm really better now," Tommy continued, "but I know that might not always be true. Cancer sometimes comes back." James felt his heart clench, but he waited for Tommy to continue. "But that's okay," Tommy said with startling calm, "because now I know that even if I get sick again, I'll still be a guard. And all the other kids will still be guards too. We'll take care of each other." The profound acceptance and maturity in Tommy's words reminded James why this 7-year-old had become a symbol of courage for people around the world. "Guard Tommy," James said formally, "you have taught me more about honor, duty, and service than any training manual ever could. It has been the privilege of my career to serve alongside you." Tommy smiled and saluted James with perfect precision. James returned the salute, and in that moment the circle was complete. The guard who had learned to show compassion, and the child who had found strength in ceremony had created something lasting and beautiful together. As the months that followed would prove, the impact of their connection continued to grow. The Honorary Guard Corps expanded to include children facing all kinds of challenges, not just illness but poverty, family trauma, and other hardships. The simple idea that everyone could be a guard, that everyone had something to protect and something to offer, resonated far beyond anyone's expectations. James continued his service at the palace, but with a fundamentally changed perspective. He still maintained perfect protocol when appropriate, but he also understood when to prioritize human connection over rigid rules. His example influenced an entire generation of guards, creating a culture within the service that balanced tradition with compassion. Tommy returned to school, grew stronger, and never stopped being a guard. He organized support groups for other young cancer survivors, visited hospitals to share his story, and maintained correspondence with honorary guards around the world. His annual visits to the palace became a tradition, each one drawing larger crowds of families who had been touched by his story. Dr. Chen later wrote in a medical journal about the Tommy effect, the measurable improvement in treatment compliance and emotional well-being among pediatric patients who participated in honorary guard programs. The simple act of reframing their experience from victims to protectors had profound psychological benefits that enhanced their medical treatment. The story that began with a sick little boy wanting to meet a palace guard had become proof that courage is contagious, that compassion creates ripples that spread far beyond their origin, and that sometimes the most important protocols are the ones written in human hearts, rather than regulation books. Years later, when James finally retired from the Queen's Guard, his service record included a notation that had never appeared before: distinguished service in establishing compassionate protocols and mentoring the first honorary Guard Corps. But the real measure of his legacy lived in the thousands of children around the world who learned that bravery comes in many forms, and that true guards protect not just places and people but hope itself. Tommy, now a healthy teenager with a full head of hair and a bright future ahead of him, spoke at James's retirement ceremony. His final words captured the essence of what they had created together. Sergeant Mitchell taught me that the best kind of guard duty is helping others stand guard over their own dreams. That's a mission that never ends, and it's the most important service anyone can give. The boy who had wanted to meet a guard had ended up changing what it meant to be one, and the guard who had learned to care had discovered that strength and kindness weren't opposites, but the twin foundations of true service. Their story became a reminder that in a world often focused on following rules, sometimes the most important thing we can do is remember the reasons behind those rules, and have the courage to choose compassion when it matters most.